beginners, as you might think, but they're also common with contractors. So some of the same things that you would do wrong, maybe, amazingly, a lot of contractors do the same thing. Why is that true? Well, one of the reasons is there's not a lot of legislation, a lot of legal requirements to become a contractor in Texas. In fact, there's very little. In some communities, there is nothing that you have to do to be a contractor and call yourself a contractor. And that doesn't mean may mean you have zero skills in it, but maybe perhaps you know how to sell. And if you know how to sell and tell people that you can do it for less, then you probably will sell some projects. And that's not what it takes to really do the job, but that's what it takes to sell a job in many cases. So our competition sometimes is not reputable, and it's a sad thing in the remodeling industry, and we are here to set matters straight. I get pretty passionate about doing things the right way in remodeling so that we don't have a bad reputation in the industry as a whole. We want to raise the bar as it is, and so if you can listen to some of these things that should be done correctly, you will see differences in the way that many people are actually doing it, and we want to give you the information you need. So again, you can join in live, ask any question about your project at 737-1200 or at Facebook, on Facebook at KM Builders. And so we talked in the previous session about this, about foundations are commonly built wrong. And we went into details about the steel reinforcement, the fill materials. You don't use dirt under a foundation. That expands and contracts, and that means your foundation can move. We've talked about piers. We've talked about whether or not you can use a patio. In many cases you cannot. And we talked about moisture coming through patios. We've talked about windows, how they're improperly flashed. Many times people put foam insulation that expands and it damages the window and the operating of the window. We also have, we talked a little bit about showers and floors and not using proper waterproofing membranes and shower pans. And so there's a lot of techniques that are used which bypass some of the right ways to do it. Grouts that absorb moisture and also stain and have to be maintained, and nobody can do that, so they end up looking very ugly very quick. So there's ways and solutions to all these things. Insulation, one of the things we'll mention this week is on insulation. It sounds so simple, but people install insulation wrong all the time, and a lot of contractors do not know the right way, especially these contractors that have very little experience in the industry. As we said, they don't have to have a lot to do it. In San Antonio, you do need a contractor's license to do most of these projects, but that doesn't mean they get caught if they don't have it. And to be honest, the requirements for getting a contractor's license, even here in San Antonio, is not very strict. So just basically don't be a criminal, then you can get a contractor's license. And I'm disappointed in that. San Marcos has my backing because they have a very strict testing that goes on. Of course, we've done work in San Marcos and we've qualified for that. It's a long test that has to be taken in a classroom where it's very closely monitored. If you don't know the building industry, you're not going to be able to work in San Marcos. And I wish San Antonio would adopt something like that, because it would eliminate a lot of the differences between contractors, and they would be up at a higher level. So even insulation is one that people make a lot of mistakes on. The paper barrier that you see that holds it together and that is used as a stapler attachment sometimes is installed backwards. It's installed where it's on the outside, and that is not what you want. You want that insulation face to be able to trap those air molecules. You want them to be able to try to get in there and slow the movement of and migration of air molecules. So insulation is designed to trap those air molecules and to isolate them and to keep them from mixing with another air temperature. Air wants to even out, and when you allow that insulation to be facing it, it does its proper job. So don't turn it around the wrong way. But even bigger mistake is a lot of times people are putting insulation in attics and they fill it up all the way as much as they can. That's a good thing in a way, to put in nice levels of insulation. You might be up to a foot thick or more. That's not a problem in itself. But most attics need to be ventilated. They may even have ridge venting, which we highly recommend in most places. and radiant barrier. You want soffit venting that allows that flow through, so air can flow through and take out that hot air out of your attic and let it flow upward. As air builds in its heat temperature, thermal temperature, it starts to rise and it starts to go up to the top. The hottest air is at the top. You can bring cooler in through the bottom of your eaves and let that go out to the peak of your roof, the very top of your roof. And when that design is working, it really does reduce the air oppression, which means that air molecules are starting to expand as they get hotter, and they're pushing down on the insulation. And it's forcing hotter air molecules into your insulation in your attic. And eventually those get hotter, and the ones down below them get hotter until it touches the sheetrock. Your sheetrock gets hotter by conduction, and that's not a good thing. So the best way to prevent that is, one, to have thicker insulation and to make sure it's in good condition. You never want to compress insulation by shoving more insulation into a space. We think of clothing and so forth, and the more insulation layers we have on, that makes us warmer, and it's true, but that doesn't work in insulation, because you need the air molecules to be stacked up. And when an insulation gets compressed, all of those air molecules start to condense. If that were the case, then something more dense would be a better insulator than something less dense like insulation. So you can take wood as an example. A 3.5 inch thick piece of wood would not be as good of an insulator as a 3.5 inch piece of insulation, thick insulation. So if you start compressing insulation down and make it dense like wood, it's going to conduct heat. And that's one thing that insulation does not do. It does not conduct it. Those strands are so loosely in there that they do not conduct virtually anything. But when you start compressing it, it does. Those strands of glass, or whatever you're using, of rock, if it's rock wool, they actually start conducting, and you do not want that. And those air molecules touch each other a lot quicker. So you have conduction and then the air molecules moving, and that's what you're trying to isolate and prevent. And so you do not want to compress insulation, thick insulation, into a smaller area, into a tighter space than what you would normally want. And then going back to this attic ventilation system that goes up through the roof, you definitely want to make sure that insulation is not chopping off the airflow at the end where the roof and the ceilings meet. You need a space for that air to flow through. It doesn't need to be big. It can be an inch to an inch and a half. That'll work. Even 3/4 of an inch would work. So when your insulation is stacked up higher, you only have about a 3.5 inch opening typically on most rafters to let air through. And when you stack up 3.5 or 5 inch or 12 inch insulation, it completely blocks off that 3.5 inch opening to get the air from the overhangs or the eaves up through the roof. And so how do you avoid that? Well, you put the insulation in thick like you want it, and then you have these little perforated waffle trays that you shove in there, and it just moves the insulation a little bit. It's like putting fingers in and pressing down to let in some air, pulling down your insulation a little bit just for some gaps so air can flow through. And they come in trays about 2 feet long, and you shove those in at each point, each rafter bay, between the 2 rafters that are going up. You shove those in, and that allows airflow between each rafter bay. And a lot of insulating companies know all this, do it right. If you hire them, they do it right, but you do need to monitor it. I've seen jobs where that's not done. And then homeowners tend to not know that. They tend to put it right up tight, fill it up with insulation, or even have it blown in, and then they've choked off all their airflow to the attic. So even though the insulation's trying to do its job, you've actually trapped air inside your attic, and eventually that will push itself through the insulation, and you will not excuse me, you will not be getting the benefits of your insulation, because it would do a lot better job with air moving and not staying stagnant and expanding and pushing into your insulation. That's why you want airflow, because the air will expand and all the molecules will push into your insulation. So we're going to talk about a couple of other things, from low slope roofs to decks being improperly built, room additions, and so forth, when we come back to the K & Builders Remodeling and Design Show.
Like a lot of guys approaching a milestone.
So I will take any questions off air while we're in our breaks. That's a great time for me to answer any personal questions. So I don't know if the show's going to be cut short or not because of all the downtime. He thought it was a pre-recorded show, and next week we will have a pre-recorded show. And that subject has to do with the top remodeling, most popular remodeling projects in the industry. So that's going to be next Saturday on August 12th. We'll be discussing the most popular remodeling projects, and not only how popular they are, but why they're so popular and why you might want to move something up on your list when you see the benefits and some of the resale values of some of these projects. But last week we talked about tile being installed improperly, and not only in showers where sometimes waterproofing is not installed correctly, but and I'll say, just comment on that, they used to use a green waterproofing sheetrock on showers, and that was done for decades. And what eventually happens is the moisture gets in there, and that sheetrock, even though it's a water resistant sheetrock, eventually deteriorates and the tile falls off of the walls. You're dependent on your grout. That's not a good waterproofer at all, and it just really eventually lets moisture and condensation to the back side of the tile, and it allows moisture into that sheetrock, and your sheetrock deteriorates, and in the meantime, before it falls off and before you see it, it's got mold back there. And so it's not a good thing. It's not healthy. It's a very inexpensive way to put tile on, and it will not last. So make sure you don't use the water resistant sheetrock only. You can use it, but you have to have something else over it, like a hardy backer is a good one. And then when you put the hardy backer on the shower walls, you want to waterproof all those joints and all those penetrations with your screws or nails. And all of those need to be waterproof so that it does not absorb it. You would want to put something behind the hardy backer over the sheetrock also to let that be a drain plane and to keep that moisture from coming down over and into a tub or into the shower pan of a shower. And so don't follow the old way of doing it, which is still done by a lot of people with inexperience. The hardy backer is a good question. I think we just got that question. So what is hardy backer? That is a fiber cement product, and typically it comes in 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch thicknesses. It comes in 3 foot by 5 foot sheets, and it's installed in areas where moisture is an issue, like a shower. It's also done in areas for strength on floors. It's a great product. Your tile adheres to it very, very well, and so it prevents it loosening up and coming off. But it is also impervious to moisture, so it itself will be able to handle the moisture. But it also, you do not want the moisture going through it. That's why these waterproofings are done. We're back alive now. Welcome back. Welcome back. I don't know why it's not working. Welcome back to the KM Builders Remodeling and Design Show. And we are live on Facebook, and we're taking some of the questions off the air too, but you can call in live right now at 737-1200. We are discussing mistakes in the remodeling industry. And we've just got through discussing insulation and how it's improperly installed in many cases. Off the air, we were discussing about hardy board and hardy backer and how it needs to be properly installed and not directly attached to the water resistant sheetrock that so many times has been done. So water resistant sheetrock is not the solution for a tile shower. I want to also announce that we're live on Facebook and YouTube at KM Builders 1. So if you look on there at KM Builders 1, and you can join us live on the broadcast today. Again, we are taking your calls live at 737-1200. If you have any questions about it, again, we want to set the matter straight in just about anything in remodeling. We've been doing it for a very long time. KM Builders has been in business for 33 years, and I've been the general manager and owner of that company. So we would love to have you ask more questions in person. If you would like to ask a lot of questions, I can do that in person and give you a free consultation and just get to know you and your project a little bit. and be able to help you out. I know it's a lot of fun meeting you face to face at your home, and so please don't hesitate to call us at 680-5626 for any in-depth discussions you would like to have. And if you just want a phone call back, I'll do that for you, and we'll call and talk about it. We are talking about mistakes in the remodeling industry, what's so common today. And it's not only amateurs who make these mistakes. Again, it's contractors who do it all the time. And it's one of the main reasons I started this show, was to get these guys out of the business and stop them from hurting people. Let's go ahead and ask a question, answer a question live on 737-1200. I believe, Bob, you had a question about Hardy Board?
Siding on my home, and I don't think they got the insulation right. What would you look for? Because I got to do another home as well. They said that they were going to replace all the bad insulation, and it didn't look to me like they did it. But is that what you're supposed to do? Is pull all the bad stuff out and put the new in?
Yes, Bob, that is right. You would want to make sure that when you're opening up the walls, that's your best chance of getting that bad insulation out of there. You'll see water damage on a lot of this insulation when we pull off the siding. So did it have tar paper underneath? Could you see that?
I believe there was, yes sir.
Okay, so the tar paper sometimes hides the damage, and if it's in good shape, sometimes it's protecting it all right. But I mean, if the tar paper was still there, it's impossible to say whether the insulation needed to be replaced or not. They probably...
I pulled the tar paper, they pulled that off.
Oh.
White type film looking material and sheets of plywood.
Okay, so you got to see the insulation then, you were just wondering how could you tell if it was in good condition or not? Is that correct?
Well, like you said, isn't that the best time to upgrade and do good things with your insulation?
Absolutely. So, you're not going to want to take sheetrock off the walls later on, and that's usually your next alternative other than blowing something in the walls, which is very difficult to do and very expensive. So you're right. I mean, you should take off that siding, take off the tar paper, examine the insulation, and any places that have had moisture damage or where they've settled, and a lot of times the insulation will settle and you'll have gaps at the top. And so you can either put in small strips of insulation in those, get rid of the stuff that's been damaged. A lot of times there's insects and so forth in there who deteriorated the insulation, and that is the best time. And I'm just going to go ahead and mention another problem that we see when people pull off the siding, Bob, and that is that there's sometimes the 4x8 sheets of siding that were installed before are actually a type of bracing material for those walls. And when they pull them off, they may not be careful about the fact that the house can shift. And in a high wind situation, we had one just recently here, the houses can actually start shifting, and because they didn't brace it up while they were doing their work. So you never want to take a house of siding all off at the same time and then have this house shift on. You want to do it in small parts so that you can maintain the structural strength of it. But you're right, Bob, that insulation is a great time to replace it is when that siding comes off and that tar paper is exposed and you can see what's in there. I hope you get a good job and you have success with your project. If you have any chances to do that before they're done, then I mean, that's what should be done.
All right, man. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Have a great day. And just like that, you can call 737-1200, and I can try to help you with your questions. Now, maybe Bob saved a lot of you from making a mistake, which would mean an opportunity lost is really what we're talking about in this case. You definitely want to get that looked at whenever you have your walls open. We always do that for our clients. We look at it, we show them, and normally we find two things. We find insulation that needs to be adjusted or repaired, perhaps even ripped out because of water damage. And then usually where there's water damage on siding like this, when people are getting their siding replaced, there usually is some water damage. The good news is it's pretty easy to repair once you open up these walls, and typically you can add a few more blocks in there, clean out the dirt, the mold, or whatever, spray that mold down with a mildewcide antibacterial, and we use like a microban on that. It has a residual that kills for years. And then you close that, put that insulation back, close up those walls. And that's the right thing to do to your walls and to your house. because it's probably been that way for 20 years, more, maybe 30, 40 years, and that insulation has deteriorated some. Now, you don't have to replace all the insulation, and you can if you want to. It's really not that bad of an investment to do if it's all open. Take it out, get an insulation company in there. They do it really inexpensively while the walls are open. Now, years and years ago, it was R11 was the maximum thickness that builders would put in there in a wall cavity that was 3.5 inches deep, which is your typical wall thickness. Nowadays, we can put an R13 in there for very little money. So make sure you do your walls right if you're doing siding. Thanks for that call, Bob. And we'll take more calls. We're going to go to news break right now, so be sure and call us at 737-1200 when we get back to the KM Builders Remodeling and Design Show. So that's how we take those calls. Could you hear them all right?
Mm-hmm.
So if anybody calls, this is the first time we've been able to take a call live and be able to turn it off. I have to turn things off in the studio whenever we get a call. So hopefully it came out all right. So talking more about mistakes in remodeling, some of the ones that we covered last week, which some of you may not have been able to do, we didn't do it live on Facebook for sure, was when we're installing tile on a second floor. When we do it on a second floor, there should be a hardy backer attached to that subflooring. Subflooring is the thing that gives you the strength when you're walking on the floor. It's wood, it's a plywood or an OSB, and it's typically at least 3/4 of an inch thick. Sometimes it's thicker, but that's usually in really nicer homes, and some of the modern techniques use a thicker one. OSB stands for oriented strand board. Some people call it wafer board. It looks like wafers of wood that are crossed and they're matched and they're glued together in a very, very high press, high strength press. So it is very strong. It works very, very well. It also resists moisture during the construction phase. If it gets rained on, it doesn't really hurt it. Plywood tends to be damaged more likely in rains than OSB. Plywood, you know what plywood is. It's a 3/4 thickness layer that's tongue and groove in floors. And by the way, the oriented strand board, 3/4, it's also tongue and groove. So it goes in, and the reason that you have to have tongue and grooves in floors and where you don't do it on roofs is because you're walking on that, and they will separate if they're together and they don't have a joint like that. They will actually start to separate, and you can't have that on certain types of flooring, and you don't want to feel that anyway. And they'll start to warp at different levels, and you become little ridges there. So you always use a tongue and groove, and that's called the subfloor. That's the strength of your second floor, and it is also a good layer that you must attach another layer to whenever you're doing tile. You have to have another layer before doing tile on those floors. Carpet, not so much. You can get by, you just put a pad. And floating floors, like laminate floors and luxury vinyl plank, you do not have to put another layer over it. It usually is okay. You may need to sand the joints down a little bit, but when you do tile, you've got to put a hardy board, which is a fiber cement backer board, before you put the tile. Now, typically 1/4 inch works. You can do 1/2 inch, but it raises things up a little more. So 1/4 inch, and it must be thin set. That means you're using an adhesive product called a thin set adhesive bonder, and it bonds that subfloor layer that you walk on, that structural layer, to the layer that you're going to now put under your tile, which is that hardy board, that hardy backer. That hardy backer has to be bonded to it so they become one layer moving in unison. Makes it a lot stiffer, and it makes it highly unlikely that your tile will pop loose with movement, because second floors do have movement. So you're taking a lot of the movement out by bonding that layer, but a lot of tile setters will not do that. They will just screw that layer down, put their tile to it, and then hope that it doesn't pop, and it usually does. So it needs to be bonded to the subfloor layer, and you use a thin set, and then you can put tile after that is cured and hardened up. So that is a very common mistake in the remodeling industry. They do not do that, and you want to use what's called an LFT thin set on that. It has a modifier in it. And don't use the cheapest, least expensive thin sets either when you're setting your tile. You want a modified thin set that allows for a better bonding to that hardy backer board or any type of product you're putting it on. The modified thin set is more expensive, but it has a much higher level of bonding, and a better cure rate makes it harder. So cheap thin set, cheap tile setters that do that work really inexpensively are using cheap products, and you're going to have tiles popping up, even if it's on concrete. And by the way, tile doesn't go directly on concrete. You almost always have to use a floor leveler. So another big mistake is not putting a floor leveler, and especially on large body tiles over 12 inches, you need to have more floor levelers, because they will not sit straight. You will have ridges, and your floor will look like it has waves in it. You have to have an expert come in and straighten out those floors. Concrete is not as straight as people think it is. And when you start putting flat products on there that do not bend like tile, you find out how crooked your floor really is. And this is common. Doesn't mean it was done wrong, it's just industry standard. Concrete's not going to be perfectly straight. Maybe you've seen that on sidewalks at night when headlights shine on them. There's a lot of ripples and undulations in concrete. Same is true in your house. You don't see it, you don't feel it with carpet, but a lot of people are pulling out carpet these days, so they start seeing these problems they didn't realize. And that is a very common mistake. We're going to talk on air about taking off, removing textures on ceilings, and it's another area where builders have made things less expensive, and so people want to go back and reverse those things because they don't like the way they look, and they find out that it's a lot harder to do than they thought to get it back to a better standard. So we're about to go live, and we're going to talk about removing texture from ceilings, the right way and the wrong way to remove that popcorn texture from those ceilings. I think I did it the wrong way. We are live. Give us a call. Welcome back to the KM Builders Remodeling and Design Show. I am Keith Maley, and glad to take your calls live if you would like. We are also live at YouTube and Facebook at kmbuilders1.com. kmbuilders1. And of course, anytime you'd like to log onto our website and see some of our great fans and wonderful projects, that is kmbuilders.com. So kmbuilders1 is where we're at Facebook at kmbuilders1, YouTube at kmbuilders1. And so please join us there live if you can, and give us a call at 737-1200. We are discussing mistakes in the remodeling industry, what's very common. And one of the things that we discussed last week had to do with tile on floors and not thin setting them. Do not put tile directly on your subfloor, which is your plywood or your OSB floors. Do not put it directly on there. And your hardy backer doesn't go screwed onto that directly either. It's supposed to be thin set onto the subfloors. And there's some exceptions where you can do it, but most of the time you want to thin set that to it. The other thing we want to talk about is a lot of time on textures, removing textures. Now, when people are putting, let me go back to the tile real quick. When people are putting tile on concrete, that is another common mistake. Putting tile on concrete and just using thin set on there and adhesive, thin set adhesive directly to the concrete is a problem for several reasons. One is you want a modified thin set, and you want to make sure that it's bonding to that floor. You may walk away from it, your contractor may walk away from it, and then within months you're going to have tiles popping or hollow sounding tiles. It can happen to anyone, but the processes you use can diminish this from happening tremendously by using a modified thin set, prepping these floors, making sure they're really clean, and the tile industry has strict standards on applying it to concrete floors. But another thing that's a common mistake is they're not using a floor leveling material. It's a floor leveling compound which is spread out by hand and floated out much like trowel and joints on sheetrock. And they check your floors first to see how straight they are, or I should say how crooked they are, because every floor is crooked. It has humps, it has undulations in it, it has divots in it. little slight dips, sometimes large dips and large humps. These need to be taken out. If you're going to use a tile over 12 inches, it really needs to be taken out, because they will show even worse, and you'll have, remember, tile does not bend. You cannot flex it to go over a hump and then pull the ends down so that you don't trip over the edges. It's going to stick up somewhere. And people find that this is a lot harder than they expected, and they buy a big body tile not realizing how much work has to go into those floors to be able to. If you use a 24-inch by 24-inch tile, then you will probably, on a large home, you will probably spend in the neighborhood of $700 or more, maybe $1,000 for thin setting your floor, or for leveling up and floor leveling your floors on a large tile like that. If you're using a 48-inch strip tile that looks like wood, maybe, you're going to spend that kind of money. Now, on a smaller house, 1 story, the first floor, you might spend, you know, $300, $200. But when you get long tiles like that, you expect to spend some money on leveling these floors, pre-leveling them before the tile goes on. This is a mistake that's made by inexperienced homeowners, and it's also made by contractors who are trying to get one up on you. They do not tell you all of this. And so when you go into a tile setter telling you how much that they are going to charge you per foot, realize there may be other charges, or you're going to have an unsatisfactory result. So why are slabs crooked? Why do they have these dips and cavities in them? Because it's a standard in the industry. It is pretty difficult to get a perfectly flat slab. In fact, it's virtually impossible. But it is not going to say that concrete finishers couldn't do a better job. But when builders are building in subdivisions and building mass production, they're not going to pay the kind of money for a concrete finishing crew to do a perfect job. And for one reason, it's not needed. Most people would never see it. You probably didn't see it on your home until you took the carpet out and you said, I want to put tile floors, and I want to do wood floors. And then you're finding out that your floor is not straight. Hopefully you didn't find out the hard way after they finish the job, and then you find out you don't like the results, but that could happen. So be real careful about making sure you know what you've got going into it. Especially if you're doing it yourself, you're going to realize that this is not going to produce satisfactory results. Putting wood floors or tile in those situations directly to the concrete will leave a roller coaster effect. It'll look like it's rolling, like rolling hills in your house. And you never saw it before with carpet, because carpet has a pad under it and it cushions and evens out. And you just don't feel it. It's not something you would feel in most cases, but you will notice it visually when you have really flat products on there. Flat products like wood, flat products like tile are going to show every movement in that floor. And that's when you notice that your floors are not straight. So they don't pay concrete finishers enough to get these perfectly straight. Now, it costs a lot of money to get perfectly smooth concrete, and not every crew is used to doing it. So realize that your house does not have that type of concrete. It is crooked. It's got movement in it, and you need to fix that before you do these other types of floors. So that's one way that a builder saves money. When the old way of doing carpet was everywhere. It was a lot less expensive on the product, a lot less expensive on the installation, and it was a lot less expensive on the concrete finishing. The same is true of the old popcorn ceilings, on the texture on your ceilings in your house. I know you don't like it probably, so why is it that way? Well, one of the reasons, main reason is it hides a lot of imperfections. And you think, my ceiling doesn't have imperfections, it just has popcorn. That's the only thing I don't like about it. Well, you'll find out that that's not true. You will find out that that popcorn ceiling breaks up light. It also helps a little bit with acoustics, but mainly it breaks up light, and you cannot see how much of up and down is going on in your ceiling. Your sheetrock is not perfectly straight like it looks at first glance. And it takes a trained eye to see what's going to happen after you pull that popcorn down. Most people cannot see it, and many times, even after you start taking it down, you still can't see it. So a lot of contractors will give you a price to remove that popcorn texture, and then they will give you a price to put a smooth ceiling or a smooth texture or a type of orange peel type finish, which is considered a splatter finish. And it's a lot smoother, it looks a lot better, but it doesn't look better whenever it has not been done properly. If you just do that one step of removing it and then floating it out maybe once, you're not going to be satisfied with the results. Your ceiling will look crooked. And I've seen it many, many times, and it does not look good. So what you should know is that that needs to be floated out, usually several times. Because every place where there's a rafter in your ceiling and the sheetrock is attached, it's usually lower, and in between it's higher. Or sometimes it's the reverse. But normally the sheetrock bows in between all of the rafters. And so they have to float out those areas where the rafters are at to get it to even out and to make it, take out these contours and make it look flat in between. That really helps to make your new texture look right. And you can't see it until you get the paint on it. That's what's sad. You can do all this work, and maybe you hired the contractor just to do the texture and you would do the painting. Well, he's long gone by the time you're painting your ceiling and you're not satisfied. So make sure you know what you're getting, and make sure that you have it in your contract with them to make sure that it is actually going to look straight, and that you will not be able to see it. From standing up, you should not be able to see that your ceiling looks crooked. And if they'll give you that guarantee and say they'll stick with the project until it doesn't show any imperfections from standing on the ground, then you've got something that you can count on. But most of the time that's not worked into these contracts, and people are very disappointed with how crooked their ceilings look. Whereas before, they thought their ceilings were straight. They just wanted the popcorn ceiling removed, the popcorn texture. So that's not a very good idea to do. You're going to make your house look actually worse. Whenever we talk about floating out the ceiling, we're talking about using a joint compound that comes in a box pre-mixed, or they can use it in a powder. And this is what tape and floaters use when they have what's called a taping knife. It looks like a putty knife, but it's even wider. And they spread these out. They have a 6-inch and a 8-inch and a 12-inch knife that's supposed to lay mud down in these hollows. And it lays it out and spreads it out so that it's starting, and you lay one layer, then another layer. Typically you put 3 layers to make things look flat on walls. Sheetrock walls, sheetrock ceilings are not straight. Most people don't even know that at the ends of each long edge of a piece of sheetrock, there's a tapered edge there. They are not the same thickness all the way through, and that's so that you can lay mud in there and not build up a hump. That mud, or that floating out process, is used to make your walls look really, really straight, and the same is true in your ceilings. But it takes an expert to do this. This is not a job for a beginner. It would take you forever to do a poor job, and virtually impossible to do a great job. So that is not an area that I recommend anyone do who has not been trained in it for years. It is a slow process for most people, and even then it cannot be done to the level that would be acceptable in the building industry. So use professionals on that. The guys that do it are incredibly fast. We have guys that do it for us all the time, and they do an incredibly good job, and they do it very fast. They do it very inexpensively. So this is not a DIY project. You do not want to do it yourself when it comes to tape and floating, unless you're experimenting on a little patch. But when it comes to a whole ceiling, you might be able to be taught how to take the texture down, but that's about as far as I would go. And even then, a lot of people damage their ceilings by poking it, using moisture. It becomes real soft, and they gouge their sheetrock, and they end up paying someone to do and fix these things. So this is not a DIY project. When we come back, we're going to talk about mistakes that are very common in the remodeling industry when it comes to decks and room additions. So join us when we come back after the break to the K&M Builders Remodeling and Design Show.
We just gave...
So we do have one question coming in from outside sources, and we would love to answer any of yours at Twitter or Facebook. The question was,
why weren't the ceilings just built straight first?
Yeah, why weren't the ceilings built straight from the beginning? Well, the ceilings, again, it goes to common methods of construction. Sheetrock is not perfectly straight, and sometimes in mass production, the members like trusses rafters or wall studs are not really checked that well, and they may be bowed, and so they push the wall out and in, back and forth, and that creates a crooked wall or a crooked ceiling. And sometimes they can actually shift after they're built from just warpage. That's one reason. One of the other reasons why they're not straight is because they just didn't finish the process. If you're going to fill a void like this, if it were crooked and you put mud in between it, you fill up part of that. When you put one layer over maybe where the joint in the sheetrock was, and you put a layer on it, and so it looks like this. It starts looking flatter and flatter. You take out that hump and it takes out part of it, like that. Then the next layer is filled in and it goes wider. And eventually it fills in this hump so that it is perfectly straight, or it looks perfectly straight. But that's several steps involved in getting this filled up. You put one layer in where the joint of the sheetrock, this is one piece and one piece, and you put that in and it fills it up, and then it goes wider and wider till it makes a very straight ceiling. When you use popcorn texture, you do not see it, so you do not have to go as far. It looks straight to the eye. And it's about appearances in construction to get things looking really straight. Almost nothing is perfectly straight. As we said, floors are not perfectly straight, ceilings are not perfectly straight, roofs are not perfectly straight, shingles are meant to break up the light, and heavier shingles do a better job than thinner shingles. So most things are not perfectly straight, and they look reasonably well, and that's what you're being sold. If someone wants something perfectly straight, the price goes way up. But we can do a lot giving you really nice appearances, and we can compensate for some of the things the builders did that were less expensive and done less than what you might be desired. But a lot of people just don't realize that if they are going to pull out what the builder did, many times it takes several steps to get it back and look good, to do a different product in there. You can't just substitute one product for another and have it just work in the same situation. The situation is different for some products than it is for others, such as wood floors, tile products, sheetrock textures are some good examples of you just don't make a substitute one for the other. But a lot of people do it anyway, even though it produces less than satisfactory results. So I hope that answers your question. Anybody else that wants to answer a question, just tweet us or get it on @KMBuilders1 on Facebook. And thanks to Morgan for helping me in the studio today. It's our first live YouTube broadcast. We currently have over 1,000 viewers, followers on our YouTube channel, and we hope to make it bigger and bigger and help more people with our remodeling advice, as well as our company that does the design build work. Contact us anytime at 680-5626 or live now. Welcome back to the KM Builders Remodeling and Design Show. A little life in the fast lane. And we are live at WAI AM 1200. 737-1200 is the number you contact us if you'd like to ask a question. Well, hopefully you've benefited and learned a little bit about the common mistakes in remodeling we've been discussing. Everything from tile floors to insulation to siding, hardy backer, showers, floors. We've discussed removing textures on ceilings, and of course what you're finding is that things are not perfectly straight in most homes. They look straight, they look reasonably straight, but when you start substituting one material for another, it doesn't work in the same situation. One texture does not look the same when you take off the old texture and replace it with a different one. You have to do steps that are inherent in those. Otherwise, they would have been done from the beginning, but they didn't put them in there from the beginning because they cost more. So we want you to realize that, and don't just hire someone who says they're going to do this or that if they're not going through the proper steps, and you may not know that, unfortunately. And I definitely think some of these products and projects are not for do-it-yourselfers. Very, very common mistakes. Some of the things that do-it-yourselfers and contractors who are inexperienced do a lot of, and that is outdoor projects, such as decks. The first thing I'll talk about is the improper piers. Piers, or foundation piers, typically is what a deck rests on. You put a post, many people know that they're 4x4 posts typically underneath a deck, and that supports it well, you would think. But nobody wants to build on top of soft soils that move and expand and contract when moisture is in them or when it's gone. They expand when moisture's in them, and they contract when the moisture's gone, which we have right now, a lot of. So that means your deck is going to be moving all over the place, and it gets worse. It doesn't just go back and forth within a small range of movement. It gets worse. And so doing the pier is very, very important. Now, if I ask you, how do you put a deck post into the ground and secure it? You dig a hole, you put a post in the ground, use treated materials so it doesn't rot, and pour concrete around it, right? Wrong. That's not the way you do a deck pier. That's the way you do a fence post or a fenced 4x4. It keeps it from moving laterally. There's no real weight on a fence to push it up and down. But when you have thousands of pounds, I mean, even 4 guys weigh 1,000 pounds sometimes, standing over a deck that has wood and heavy other and maybe even furniture, you maybe have thousands of pounds bearing on one 4x4 post. You do not dig a hole in the ground, put concrete around it. That is wrong. The city of San Antonio would never pass that. In fact, your piers have to be engineered with the city of San Antonio and many other municipalities. So they're supposed to be 18-inch diameter. They're supposed to be 6 inches of concrete in the hole, in the bottom of it, 18 inches, 2 foot deep, actually 2 foot deep, and they're supposed to be 6 inches reinforced concrete. That's a big pad way down in the ground where it doesn't move much. And then you put your post on top of that, and then you can pour concrete or put dirt around it. You're not worried about the concrete on the sides. It's not going to move when you put dirt in a 2 foot deep hole. That's not the point of it, but that's the way people are doing it. They're pouring concrete around it instead of under it, and that has to solidify. It cannot be putting weight on it while it's 6 inches of concrete is curing down, way down 2 feet deep in a hole. So that is the right way to do it, and a lot of people just don't know it. So they use wrong fasteners on decks, and they end up pulling away. That's just a few of the reasons that you want to have a professional, and we'd love to look at your project. Whether it's a deck, whether it's tile work, whether it's windows, siding. Of course, we do whole home room additions and whole house remodels. Kitchens and baths are our specialties also. Just look us up at kmbuilders.com or 680-5626. That's 680-KMCO. Don't hesitate to give us a call. I'd love to come out and meet you and talk about your project. I am Keith Maley, and thank you for joining this week on the KM Builders Remodeling and Design Show. And remember, you could have someone else design or remodel your home, but then you'd have to live in it.